In the last two lectures, we've been exploring the benefits of exchange. But some critics are suspicious of the supposedly unregulated exchange that we've been discussing. What about considerations like fraud? What's to stop unscrupulous sellers from hoodwinking unsuspecting buyers? And what about discrimination? What prevents bigoted or racist employers from refusing to hire a member of a religious or racial group they dislike? In short, trade might make some people better off, but isn't it also true that unregulated markets open the door to all sorts of other social ills? Lurking behind concerns like this is another everyday economic error. This error holds that free markets are synonymous with unregulated markets. Well, in today's lecture, I'll argue that there is no such thing as an unregulated market. There never has been, and there never will be. All markets are regulated. Only, perhaps not in exactly the way that you're thinking. And this regulation plays an important role in reducing the extent of fraud and discrimination. Here's how Israel Kirzner puts it in his book, Market Theory and the Price System. To the casual observer, market activity seems like a bewildering and uncoordinated mass of transactions. Each individual in the market society is free to buy what and when he pleases, to sell what and when he pleases, to produce or to consume what he pleases, or to refrain altogether from any or all of these activities. Now listen carefully to what Kirzner says next. Economic analysis reveals that this seeming chaos in the activity of market participants is only apparent. In fact, analysis shows that the exchanges that take place are subject to definite forces at work in the market. These market forces guide the individuals participating in the market in their decisions. Okay, enough beating around the bush. What are these forces? How do they regulate market exchange? How do they curtail fraud and discrimination? Well, first, the regulations I have in mind are profits and losses. It's true, most people don't think of profits and losses as regulations, but that's because they're not looking through the opportunity cost lens. In fact, for many people, the word profit tends to be a dirty word. Why then is it helpful to think of profits and losses as an underappreciated method of regulating market activity? The reason this mental reframing is helpful is because it's the lure of profits and the threat of losses that regulate buyers and sellers' behavior. Let me offer a concrete example. Suppose a world-famous entrepreneur, like the late Steve Jobs, had imagined that what consumers want is an iPhone made of solid platinum. Based on this hunch, Jobs buys several tons of platinum, manufactures, let's say, 10 million phones with it, and attempts to sell his new creations for $50,000 per phone. He chooses that price because at any lower price, he won't cover his costs of production. Now, I'm no entrepreneur myself, but I think it's safe to say that our hypothetical, harebrained Steve Jobs would earn losses in this scenario. Why? Well, hardly anyone wants to pay $50,000 for an iPhone, even for an indestructible phone made of platinum. If Jobs had gone through with this plan, his behavior would likely have been punished by consumers. They'd force him to earn losses by not buying his phone in sufficient numbers. Now, in essence, by forcing Jobs to earn losses, consumers would be rhetorically asking Jobs a question of sorts. They'd be asking him why he deprived them of the use of platinum in dental appliances and jewelry, two contexts where consumers do value platinum being used. When Jobs uses the platinum for his phones, we can't use that same platinum in its other, more valuable uses, such as in dental appliances that make our lives more pleasant. And consumers like you and me would demonstrate our displeasure with that outcome by forcing Steve Jobs to earn losses. Of course, the reason Jobs never tried to give us the platinum iPhone, the iPlat, if you will, is because he anticipated he'd earn losses by doing so. In other words, the threat of loss was regulating, guiding, and even changing the actions he was taking. Let's now see how profits and losses also regulate the impulse toward fraud and then discrimination. First, fraud. Suppose you want a haircut. Once you're in the barber's seat, you describe what the finished product ought to look like. The barber nods as if he understands. Next, he picks up a razor and shaves you completely bald. You feel as if the whole experience is over before it even happened. Then he politely says, "That'll be $25. Thanks for your business. See you next month." You'd be shocked at his gall after having so brazenly defrauded you. We could imagine other similar scenarios. You go to your favorite exquisite seafood restaurant where you order an expensive lobster. An hour later, the waiter brings out a plate of monkfish, more commonly known as poor man's lobster. As you may know, monkfish is a very cheap lobster substitute that tastes and even looks like lobster. Half an hour later, the waiter reappears with the $50 bill. That's fraud. Both of these scenarios should seem a bit far-fetched, even though we've all occasionally had the lousy haircut or patronized the disappointing restaurant. But why are my stories so far-fetched? After all, it seems like a barber's profits would rise if he simply gave everyone a buzz cut. Think about it. Perhaps he could service 20 customers a day instead of just 6 or 7. At first glance, it might also seem like the restaurant's profits would rise by serving the cheap monkfish while charging for the expensive lobster. Why isn't virtually every seafood restaurant promising lobster and then serving monkfish? What stops the barber or the restaurant from taking advantage of you? Is it because they know that you have your lawyer on speed dial? Of course not. The costs of using the court system far outweigh any damages the courts might award you for a fraudulent meal or haircut. What's worse, the restaurant owner and the barber know this just as well as you and I do. So what stops them from defrauding you every single time you exchange with them? Well, conscience clearly constrains many sellers. They couldn't look themselves in the mirror if they lived their lives as frauds. But what about those who don't have such a tender conscience and are just out to make a quick buck? Doesn't their profit-seeking cause them to want to defraud you? In what sense is profit going to curtail their impulse to deception? Wouldn't it only pour gasoline on the fire? To answer that question, look through the opportunity cost lens with me. One force that disciplines sellers' fraudulent impulse is the threat of earning losses in the future. After all, none of us buyers would patronize this barber or restaurant again if we received the buzz cut or the monkfish. If he defrauds us, the seller will lose all the future profits he could have made from cutting our hair or serving us meals. And besides that, we'll probably tell all of our friends and post about our terrible experience on platforms like Yelp. I like to think about it this way. The shadow of the future looms over every exchange like a specter, threatening to take away future profits. But you need to be wearing your economic eyeglasses to see that far ahead. If the barber wants to keep earning profits into the future, he'll behave in the present. The evaporation of future profits is the opportunity cost of misbehaving today. Of course, that won't be enough to discipline every barber, but it does raise the cost of fraud for every barber. And over time, fraudulent barbers simply won't last. Losses will weed them from the market system, just as a gardener plucks dandelions from his flower bed. But there's a way to make this logic even more robust. A barber might tell you that he'll provide a high-quality haircut. But how do you know he places a high value on your future business? Just how serious is the threat of losing future profits to him? Some fly-by-night barbers might simply be out to make a quick buck. Those aren't the barbers you want to go to. This is an important problem because if buyers suspect that the barber won't follow through, they'll be suspicious and avoid him. This is true even if he's a high-quality, decent, honest barber. As a result of the buyer's suspicion, neither party gets the benefits from trading that we discussed in the last 2 lectures. To overcome buyer suspicions, sellers can offer so-called credible commitments to prospective buyers. As we'll see in a moment, these enable buyers and sellers to better enjoy, that is, the gains from trade. So what is a credible commitment? A credible commitment is anything that makes a promisor's word more believable. It does this by raising the promisor's opportunity cost of acting contrary to the other party's best interest. I realize that's a fairly abstract description, so what's an example? Well, my favorite example comes from Notre Dame economist and legal scholar Margaret Brennig. In her 1990 paper, Rings and Promises, she compellingly argues that engagement rings served as credible commitments to marry in the United States during the mid-20th century. Brennig notes that before 1935, American women could sue a fiancé who had broken his engagement promise. The courts would usually award monetary damages to the woman to compensate her for wedding preparation expenses, not to mention shame. In 1935, Indiana struck down such breach of promise laws. By 1945, 16 other states had followed Indiana's lead, with every other state eventually eliminating these provisions from the books. However, at the time, there was a significant social stigma for a woman who had experienced a broken engagement. Consequently, women still wanted a way to separate frivolous from serious suitors. A worst-case scenario for a woman was finding herself high and dry after an unserious man promised to marry her and then got cold feet. So what was the solution? Brennig argues that the practice of engagement ring giving arose shortly after 1935 as a way for a man to demonstrate the credibility of his marriage offer. After all, he just invested in a costly diamond ring that he'd forfeit if he broke his promise to marry. Giving a ring was a credible commitment to marry because men who weren't serious simply didn't offer them. Women now had a way of sifting the masculine wheat from the boyish chaff. Here's another example. One of the most memorable scenes in all of classic literature colorfully illustrates why people invest in so-called credible commitments. Take a look at this picture. This is Odysseus on his way home from the Trojan War, as described in the Odyssey. You've probably heard the story. Odysseus knows that anyone who hears the siren's beautiful song will jump overboard and be devoured by these alluring but ultimately ferocious creatures. He wants to listen to their music, so he binds his hands to the mast of his ship, rendering himself incapable of jumping overboard. A credible commitment does the same thing. It ties a person's hands by raising the opportunity cost of specific actions that would be otherwise enticing. Now, what does any of this have to do with disciplining fraud in markets? Here's what. Sellers can bind their hands to the mast, in a manner of speaking, by offering credible commitments to behave honestly with buyers. Advertising can serve this function. Have you ever wondered why firms spend so much money on celebrity endorsements specifically? Here's one noteworthy example. In 2014, Coca-Cola signed a $26 million contract with Taylor Swift to promote their products. Now, are consumers more likely to grab a Coke just because Taylor Swift films herself drinking one? And don't we all know she's only drinking one because Coca-Cola has paid her big bucks to do so? The economic explanation for this curious phenomenon goes like this. Sellers aren't tricking weak-willed buyers by splashing celebrity images over their products. Instead, the celebrity endorsement is a costly investment that sellers only recoup if they uphold their commitment to quality. When consumers see the catchy Taylor Swift ad, they know that the Coca-Cola company has spent tens of millions on this endorsement. And what will happen to Coca-Cola if the company begins diluting its flagship product to cut costs? Well, consumers will stop buying as much Coke, and if that happens, Coca-Cola will never recoup the tremendous investment they made in the Swift contract. They'll be out tens of millions of dollars. In other words, these massive sunk investments serve as credible commitments to maintain quality into the future. Coca-Cola just raised the opportunity cost of diluting its product. Advertising is but one of many ways that sellers can offer credible commitments to buyers. I'll mention just one more. Premium restaurant owners often locate in high rent areas of their city. This locational decision functions as a signal to consumers. Restaurants will only recoup those high rents if they don't renege on their quality commitment. If they do renege, buyers will punish the owners by refusing to patronize this restaurant. And if you're a restaurant owner who's paying a pretty penny for rent, losing patrons isn't something you can afford. So you do what you can to keep your promise of serving high-quality cuisine. No monkfish here. To sum up our discussion so far, the lure of profits often prompts sellers to invest in credible commitments, and then the threat of losses disciplines their temptation to defraud us. None of this means that fraud never happens. Of course it does. But the profit and loss system raises the cost of fraud and reduces its frequency. It's in this sense that profits and losses regulate market participants' behavior. Yes, there's a sense in which sellers can do whatever they want, but they won't be around for long if they do. Let's now see how the profit and loss system also raises employers' costs of practicing discrimination. Imagine a job that pays $40,000 a year. Imagine further that the employer dislikes people with blue eyes. He simply can't stand them. To make the example easy, let's suppose that there are just 2 applicants for this job. One has green eyes and will contribute $45,000 annually to the employer's bottom line. The other has the dreaded blue eyes, but he'll contribute $50,000 to the employer's bottom line. The blue-eyed worker is simply more skilled. Now, can the employer indulge his prejudice by hiring the green-eyed worker simply because his eyes are green? Of course he can. We're talking about a voluntary exchange here. But, crucially, this decision will cost the employer. How much? Well, it'll cost him $5,000 every single year that he indulges his bigotry. The question then becomes, is the employer willing to pay $5,000 annually just to satisfy his vile tastes? Is he willing to incur that opportunity cost? And suppose he does decide to enjoy his bigotry at the expense of the more productive worker. Well, that just means there's a profit opportunity for an unbigoted rival to hire the more productive worker and begin outcompeting the bigoted employer. In other words, the rivalry between employers exerts competitive pressure to eliminate discriminatory hiring practices. I want you to notice something else that is implicit in this logic. We should expect less discrimination the more costly it becomes. This means that we'll tend to encounter less discrimination at higher salary rates. Hiring custodial staff based on prejudice will only cost pennies out of the employer's profit. But now, imagine hiring a CEO based on eye color, skin color, sex, religious creed, or any other characteristic that is irrelevant to skillfully directing a company. In this case, the results could be catastrophic. Hiring the wrong person could mean tens of millions of dollars in foregone profits, or even the company's eventual bankruptcy. In short, the more it cuts into a company's profits, the less discrimination we should expect. And there's good empirical evidence for the ideas that we've just been discussing. In 1962, Armin Auschen, who had some of the clearest and furthest seeing economic eyeglasses in history, partnered with his co-author Reuben Kessel to publish a paper that empirically explored the logic we've been discussing. They begin their analysis by noting that firms in some industries are prohibited by law from keeping all their profits. The significance of this fact is that when firms can't keep all their profits, the opportunity cost of discrimination necessarily falls. Think back to the example I gave just a few moments ago. We said that the employer could make $5,000 in additional profit if he simply hired the disliked blue-eyed worker. But suppose that the government confiscated every last penny of that $5,000. If that were the case, there would no longer be any advantage in selecting the blue-eyed worker over the favored green-eyed worker. So the question then becomes, in what industries are firms legally blocked from keeping all their profits? Well, for starters, public utilities like water, gas, and electricity companies. In these areas, enterprises are subject to profit regulations so that the rate of return they earn can never rise above some government-stipulated minimum. Similar considerations apply to railroads, buses, airlines, and taxis. Here's what Alshin and Kessel say about firms in these industries. If these firms are able to earn more than the permissible pecuniary rate of return, then inefficiency is a free good, because the alternative to inefficiency is the same pecuniary income and no inefficiency. Unfortunately, so-called inefficiency may include indulging one's racial preferences. And that's what Alshin and Kessel find empirically. They examine employment data in different U.S. industries. Specifically, they look at the proportion of Jewish employees across sectors during the first part of the 20th century, a time when Jews were often discriminated against in the United States. To examine Jewish employment, they compare the share of Jewish to non-Jewish Harvard Business School grads employed across a variety of fields. What they learn is consistent with the logic I've been discussing. First, they find that the relative share of Jewish to non-Jewish grads is 36% overall in the 10 industries they examine. However, and crucially, in the industries subject to the strictest profit regulation, they discover that the share of Jewish to non-Jewish employment drops to 18%. Remember, it was 36% overall. That sort of difference is what we'd expect because limiting a firm's ability to earn profits lowers the opportunity cost of discrimination. If you can't keep your extra profits, it doesn't make sense to hire the best worker. You might as well hire a worker based on racial preference. So what have we learned today? Profits and losses regulate the behavior of market participants. However, to detect the regulatory function of profit and loss, we need to be wearing our economic eyeglasses. Of course, I'll say it again, the argument has never been that the profit and loss system eliminates fraud or discrimination. But remember back to our barber and monkfish examples from earlier. The real question is, why isn't there more fraud and discrimination in the world? Economics shows us that the freer the profit and loss system is, the less fraud and discrimination we'll tend to have. Markets certainly don't eliminate every last instance of discrimination, but contrast their performance with public efforts. In Lecture 3, we explored a public policy that is aimed at reducing discrimination, but in fact, only exacerbates discrimination in hiring practices. This short course has demonstrated just how far you can get with a single, straightforward economic principle: opportunity cost. If all you knew about economics was the concept of opportunity cost, you would still be able to see through many everyday economic errors. Understanding this simple yet profound concept is one reason why economists do tend to agree on a broad number of issues. Using this concept, you won't fall for the canards that any war, boosts the economy, or that rent control is a free lunch for tenants. You'll be wary of well-intentioned public policies, because now you're thinking about how they change the costs and benefits that people face. You can identify the mutual benefit in exchange, as well as some of the self-regulating properties of the profit and loss system. More than anything, I hope this short course has calibrated your first pair of economic eyeglasses. And I hope it's piqued your interest enough to keep your glasses polished and ready to use the next time life throws an economic claim your way.